Welcome, brave listeners. Tonight, I invite you to step into the darkness, to let the unknown whisper in your ear. These are not just stories. They are echoes of something deeper, something that lingers just beyond the veil of reality. Keep the lights low, the volume high, and whatever you do, don't look behind you. Now let's begin. I moved into the apartment on a gray October afternoon, the kind of day where the sky looks like stretched out wool, heavy and unbroken. The building was old, one of those pre-war structures with thick walls and narrow hallways, where every floorboard groaned beneath your step. It was exactly what I wanted. Solitude. A place to be alone with my thoughts. The landlord, a wiry man in his 60s named Mr. Greaves, handed me the keys without much ceremony. He led me up a flight of stairs, past faded wallpaper and a flickering light bulb that buzzed faintly. My unit was at the end of the hall, next to a door that didn't match the others. It was darker, almost black, with an old-fashioned keyhole beneath an knob. I must have lingered on it too long because Mr. Greaves gave a dismissive chuckle. "That one's just storage," he said. "Nothing in there but old furniture. Been locked up for years. No need to worry about it." I nodded, not thinking much of it. Every old building had its quirks. I was more focused on settling in. Inside, the apartment had a strange charm, high ceilings, ornate molding along the walls, and a single, large window that overlooked the quiet street below. The air smelled of aged wood and something faintly musty, but it felt right. A little eerie, maybe, but right. By nightfall, I was mostly unpacked. I made a cup of tea, curled up in my chair by the window, and let the city hum in the background. The apartment felt peaceful, safe. Then, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard it. A whisper. Faint, almost imperceptible, like a breath against the walls. I sat up, heart thudding. It had come from the hallway, near the locked door. I held my breath, listening. Nothing. Telling myself it was just the pipes, I forced myself to lie back down. But even in the silence, I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was behind that door, waiting. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a sound. It was soft at first, like the wind slipping through a cracked window, but as my mind cleared from sleep, I realized it was something else entirely. A melody, a low, humming tune drifting through the stillness of my apartment. For a moment, I thought it was coming from outside, maybe a neighbor playing music at an odd hour. But the more I listened, the more certain I became. It wasn't coming from another apartment. It was inside mine. I sat up in bed, every sense on edge. The tune was delicate, almost like a lullaby, wordless and slow. It reminded me of something I couldn't quite place, something buried deep in memory. I swung my legs over the bed and stood. The sound didn't change, didn't falter. It led me forward, pulling me through the dark. My breath felt too loud as I stepped into the hallway. The apartment wasn't big, just a living room, a small kitchen, and my bedroom, but in that moment, the space felt endless. Shadows stretched unnaturally long in the faint glow of the streetlights outside. The humming was clearer now. A woman's voice. Soft, almost kind, but wrong. I followed it without thinking. Step by step, I moved down the hall, my bare feet soundless on the old wooden floor. The sound guided me to the end, to the door that didn't match the others. The locked door. I stopped, staring at it. The humming continued, just beyond the wood. I reached out. My fingers brushed the doorknob. The moment I touched it, the humming stopped. Silence swallowed the apartment. The air felt heavier, charged, like the quiet before a storm. My skin prickled with something primal, something ancient inside me screaming to turn back. I stood there, heart hammering, waiting, though for what? I didn't know. Then, just as I convinced myself I'd imagined it all, I heard a whisper, directly from the other side of the door. "Don't." I yanked my hand back and stumbled away, barely remembering to breathe. The apartment was quiet again. No humming, no whisper, but I didn't go back to bed. I sat in my chair by the window, eyes locked on the locked door, and waited for morning. The next few nights were worse. At first, I tried to convince myself I'd imagined the humming, that it had been some trick of a half-asleep mind. But deep down, I knew better, because it didn't stop. It changed. On the second night, I heard whispers. I had been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, too uneasy to sleep. The apartment was silent, save for the occasional creak of the old building settling. Then, just as I was finally drifting off, I heard them. Muffled voices, low and constant, coming from behind the locked door. I couldn't make out the words, but there was something familiar about them, like a conversation I'd once overheard but couldn't quite place. The cadence, the rhythm, the way one voice murmured and another responded in hushed tones. I sat up, every muscle in my body tense. The whispers didn't stop. I forced myself to get out of bed, heart pounding as I stepped into the hallway. The air was thick, charged with something unseen, something pressing in around me. The voices continued. I took a step closer, then another. I was only a few feet from the door when the whispering stopped. Silence. I held my breath, waiting, listening. Then tap, tap, tap. Light footsteps. Pacing. Back and forth. Inside the locked room, a cold sweat broke out along my skin. I turned and walked away. I didn't run. I would not run. But I didn't go back to my bedroom either. Instead, I sat in the living room, every light on, and waited for dawn. The next night, the shadows started. It was past midnight, and I was lying awake again, not even pretending to sleep this time. I had left my bedroom door open, just enough to keep an eye on the hallway. That's when I saw it. A shadow. A sliver of darkness sliding under the locked door. It moved, shifting as if someone or something was walking just beyond. But there was no light inside that room. Nothing to cast a shadow. I watched, frozen, as the shape stretched and morphed, the edges flickering unnaturally. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. I didn't sleep that night either. By the fourth night, I was exhausted. My nerves were frayed, my thoughts jumbled. The air in my apartment felt heavy, like the pressure before a storm, and I could feel it pressing against my skin. I told myself I should leave, pack my things and go. But the thought of abandoning the apartment felt wrong, like whatever was behind that door wanted me to run. So I stayed, and that's when it called my name. It was nearly 3 in the morning. I had been dozing off in my chair, my body too tired to fight anymore. The apartment was silent. No whispers, no pacing, no shadows. Then, from behind the locked door, a whisper, soft, intimate, right up against the wood. It said my name, not shouted, not groaned, just a whisper, gentle, knowing. A cold wave of dread crawled up my spine. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, again, my name. I gripped the arms of the chair, my fingers digging into the fabric. My mind screamed at me to leave, to get out of the apartment and never look back. But I didn't move. I just sat there, staring at the door, waiting for whatever was inside to speak again. It didn't. It didn't have to, because I knew now. It wasn't just something in that room. It knew me, and it was waiting. By the 5th day, I could barely function. Sleep was a distant memory, my thoughts tangled in exhaustion and paranoia. Every shadow in the apartment seemed to stretch too far. Every creak in the floor made my skin prickle. And that room, that locked room, sat there at the end of the hall like a wound in the building itself. I needed answers. I found Mr. Greaves outside, standing by the rusted gate that led to the apartment entrance. He was smoking a cigarette, the tip glowing faintly in the dim afternoon light. I hesitated, then approached. Mr. Greaves. He turned, startled, as if he hadn't heard me come up. Something wrong. I took a breath. It's about the locked room. His expression changed immediately. The lines on his face deepened, and he shifted uncomfortably, flicking his cigarette to the ground. Told you before. It's storage. There's something in there, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I hear noises at night. Footsteps. Whispering. His jaw tightened. Pipes. I stepped closer. It said my name, Mr. Greaves. He looked away, his fingers twitching at his sides. You've been here. What, 5 days? Already losing sleep. Yeah. I nodded. He exhaled through his nose. It happens, he muttered. You live alone long enough. Mind plays tricks. You start hearing things that aren't there. I wasn't buying it. Then opened the door. Show me it's just storage. His eyes snapped to mine, something dark flickering behind them. No. I swallowed hard. Why not? He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. Look, if it's bothering you that much, maybe this isn't the right place for you. That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting. His tone made it clear this conversation was over. I watched as he turned and walked back inside, his shoulders hunched, his movement stiff. I stood there for a long time, staring at the locked door at the top of the stairs. If you wouldn't tell me the truth, I'd find it myself. I spent the next day researching. The building wasn't famous. No headline-worthy crimes, no well-known hauntings. Just another old apartment complex, nearly a century old. But the deeper I dug, the stranger things became. I started with public records, tenant lists, lease agreements, anything I could find. And that's when I noticed it. A pattern. People didn't stay in my unit for long. Every tenant over the past 20 years had either vanished or moved out abruptly. No one lasted more than a few months. Some were simply gone, no forwarding address, no trace of where they'd gone. Others broke their lease and left in the middle of the night. One name stood out, Daniel Rowe. He had lived in my apartment 6 years ago. His lease was never terminated. There was no move-out notice, no eviction. He had just disappeared. No missing person report. No official investigation. He had simply been erased. My stomach twisted. I needed more. Someone who had been here longer. Someone who might know the truth. That evening, I found her. Mrs. Holloway. She lived on the ground floor, in a cluttered little apartment filled with the scent of lavender and old paper. She was in her 70s, maybe older, with sharp eyes and a voice like dried leaves. I told her where I lived, and her expression darkened immediately. "You're in that unit?" she asked. I nodded. She sighed. "I was wondering how long it would take before you came asking." I swallowed. "You know about the room, don't you?" Her gaze flickered to the ceiling, as if she could see right through the floorboards to where it sat above us. "That room has never been empty," she murmured. A chill ran through me. "What do you mean?" She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "I've lived here 40 years. Seen people come and go. That room at the end of the hall? No one's ever stayed there long. They think they live alone, but they don't." The air in the room seemed to tighten. I forced myself to ask, "What's inside it?" She looked at me for a long time before shaking her head. Something that never left. I didn't sleep that night, because now I knew for certain. The room wasn't locked to keep people out. It was locked to keep something in. I woke to a faint rustling sound. For a moment, I thought it was the wind slipping through the old window panes, but as my mind cleared, I realized it was something else, something closer. Something inside my apartment. I sat up, heart thudding. The room was dim, early morning light seeping through the curtains. Everything was still, but then I saw it. A slip of paper. No, an envelope. Lying just inside my front door. I hadn't heard anyone slide it under. My door had been locked, but there it was, aged, yellowed, as if it had been sitting somewhere for decades before finding its way to me. Slowly, I got up, the wooden floor cold beneath my bare feet. I crouched down and picked up the envelope. The paper felt brittle, dry as old leaves. No name, no return address. I turned it over, my breath shallow, and slid my finger under the flap. Inside was a key, rust-coated, heavy, the kind that belonged to doors built long before modern locks. The kind that would fit perfectly into the keyhole of the locked door at the end of my hallway. I stared at it, my pulse pounding in my ears. I should have dropped it, should have thrown it away, left the apartment, never looked back. But I didn't, because even as dread curled in my stomach, I knew. This key was meant for me. I spent the entire day trying to ignore it. I left the apartment, wandered aimlessly through the city, lingered in cafes, bookstores, anywhere that wasn't here. But no matter where I went, my thoughts kept circling back to that key, to the door, to whatever was waiting behind it. By the time night fell, I knew I couldn't avoid it anymore. It was time. The apartment was silent as I stood in the hallway, key in hand. The locked door loomed before me, its dark wood almost seeming to breathe in the dim light. The key felt heavier now, as if something unseen was pressing against it. For the first time since moving in, I hesitated. I didn't want to know what was inside. Not really, but something wanted me to. I raised the key to the lock, paused, took a breath. Then, with shaking fingers, I slid it in. A perfect fit. I turned it. Click. The lock disengaged. The air around me seemed to hold its breath. I placed my hand on the doorknob, and slowly, I pushed the door open. The door groaned as it swung open. A gust of cold air rushed past me, sinking into my skin like icy fingers. It smelled of dust and something older, something stagnant. I hesitated on the threshold, my breath shallow. The room beyond was dim, the only light seeping in from the hallway behind me. As my eyes adjusted, I saw that the space was untouched, frozen in time. A thick layer of dust blanketed everything. The air felt dense, pressing in around me as if the room itself had been waiting, holding its breath for the moment I stepped inside. There wasn't much furniture. A dresser stood against the far wall, its mirror so clouded with age that it barely reflected anything. To the side, an old rocking chair sat eerily still, its curved wooden frame worn with time. And then there was the trunk, a large, locked trunk in the center of the room. My stomach twisted at the sight of it. Everything about this place felt wrong. The dust, the untouched furniture, the silence. No, not silence. The humming was back, but it wasn't coming from the room. It was inside my head. The same eerie lullaby from before, curling around my thoughts like a whisper I couldn't shake. It grew louder, more insistent, as if something unseen was pressing against my mind, pouring the sound into me. I clenched my jaw, gripping the door frame to steady myself. The air felt heavier, thicker, pressing against my lungs. Then, right beside my ear, a faint sigh. Soft, cold. Something exhaled against my skin. A shiver shot down my spine, and every instinct screamed at me to run. But I didn't, because I couldn't shake the feeling that if I turned around now, I wouldn't be alone. Something would be standing right behind me, waiting. The humming in my head pulsed like a second heartbeat as I stepped forward, my feet kicking up soft clouds of dust. My gaze locked onto the trunk. It sat there, waiting. I crouched down, my fingers trembling as I brushed off the thick layer of dust. The metal latch was rusted but gave way with little effort. The lid groaned as I lifted it, revealing its contents. Inside were old, yellowed papers, letters, photographs, a small, leather-bound journal. I picked up the first photograph. A man and a woman stood in the very room I was in now. The rocking chair behind them, the dresser in the same place. They were young, smiling, their hands clasped tightly together. But the edges of the photo were brittle, the ink faded with time. I flipped through more. Some showed the couple embracing, others captured stolen moments, a kiss, a shared laugh, a scribbled note tucked into the corner of one. Their love felt real, alive. Then I found the letters. They were handwritten in elegant script, filled with longing and sorrow. I wait for you every night, but you don't come. I hear your voice in the walls and the wind, but I know it's only my mind tricking me. You promised we'd never be apart. If you can still hear me, meet me again in the room where we promised to stay together. A chill settled into my bones. I reached for the journal, its worn leather cover cold beneath my fingertips. As I opened it, I skimmed through entries describing their days in the apartment. Small joys, whispered confessions, moments of happiness. But as I neared the end, the tone shifted. The writing became frantic. Desperate. He's gone. I still hear him at night. I know he's here with me. He just doesn't remember. I won't leave. I promised. I promised. The final entry was only one sentence. If you can still hear me, meet me again in the room where we promised to stay together. A cold breath of air whispered against my skin. Slowly, I looked up and froze. Across the room, the mirror on the dresser no longer reflected me. Instead, a shadowy figure stood there, motionless, watching. And as I stared, my breath caught in my throat. Because the figure wasn't just looking at me. It was whispering my name. The figure in the mirror shifted. Slowly, impossibly, the shadow began to take shape, limbs stretching, features forming like ink bleeding through paper. A woman. Her face was pale, almost translucent, her eyes dark hollows filled with something broken. Grief clung to her like mist, wrapping around her thin frame, her tangled hair. Her lips moved, but the sound came from everywhere. A whisper, soft at first. Please. I've been waiting so long. A sob broke through the air, raw and aching. Don't go. Please don't leave me here. My chest tightened, my fingers going numb. This wasn't just a spirit. It was something hungry. I took a step back, my mind screaming for me to get out. And the door behind me slammed shut. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot, sending dust billowing into the air. I spun around, grabbing the handle, twisting, pulling locked. A cold breath ghosted against the back of my neck. You can hear me now. Her voice was closer. I turned back toward the mirror. She was no longer inside it. She was in the room with me. The air grew thick, suffocating. The humming in my head swelled, rising into whispers, then voices, dozens, maybe more, merging together in a frenzied, deafening chorus. A rush of movement, shadows spilling from the walls, crawling toward me. The room felt smaller, pressing in, the weight of unseen hands closing around my wrists, my throat. I staggered back, gasping. And then, the voices stopped, all but one. A single whisper, soft and final. "Stay with me." The air turned ice cold. I couldn't breathe. The darkness pulled. I don't know how I moved. One moment, the shadows were closing in, the air thick with whispers, a presence wrapping around me like unseen arms. The next, I was running. My body slammed against the door, hands fumbling, clawing at the handle. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out the desperate voice behind me. "Stay with me." I twisted the knob once, twice, please, 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 and then, suddenly, it gave way. The door flew open, and I stumbled out into the hallway, nearly collapsing onto the floor. Silence. No cold air. No voices. Just my ragged breathing in the dim light of the apartment. I turned back, expecting, I don't know what. The woman. The shadows. The whispering presence that had almost pulled me under. But the room. The room was empty. Pristine. No dust. No trunk. No rocking chair. No dresser. Nothing. As if it had never existed at all. I staggered back, my head spinning. My mind screamed at me to leave, to run, to never look back. And I did. I moved out the next morning. I didn't argue with the landlord, didn't ask any more questions. I just packed up my things and left, pretending none of it had happened. But pretending doesn't make something untrue, because the whispers never stopped. I hear them in quiet moments, in empty rooms, in the hush between heartbeats. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I wake up knowing I'm not alone. A breath at my ear, a sigh behind me, and always, always a voice, soft and pleading. "Stay with me." I never expected to inherit anything, let alone a mansion. My name is James Whitaker. I'm 32 years old, a historian by training and a writer by passion. My work revolves around uncovering forgotten family histories, stories of old wealth, vanished legacies, and the lives left behind in crumbling estates. But I never imagined I would become part of one myself. The Whitaker family estate had stood untouched for decades, abandoned on the edge of a dense forest, miles from the nearest town. I had never met my great-uncle Elias, the last known resident of the house. To my knowledge, no one in my immediate family had spoken to him in over 40 years. Yet, after his passing, the estate had been left to me, his only living heir. The house, as described in the legal documents, was in a state of disrepair, neglected, but structurally sound. It had been built in the late 1800s, a grand structure in its time, but long since overtaken by the slow decay of abandonment. The idea of solitude intrigued me. I had been looking for an escape from the city, a quiet place where I could focus on my writing. What better inspiration than an old family estate, with its dusty corridors and forgotten histories? With that thought, I packed my things and made the drive out to Whitaker House. The first thing that struck me when I arrived was the silence. The house sat on a slight hill, half concealed by skeletal branches of oak trees, their gnarled limbs reaching toward the slate-gray sky. The air smelled damp, filled with the scent of moss and rotting leaves. My tires crunched over the gravel driveway as I pulled up to the front steps. The mansion loomed above me, 3 stories tall, its dark windows staring vacantly into the overcast afternoon. The key, an old iron thing with an ornate handle, turned stiffly in the lock. With a sharp creak, the door swung open, releasing a breath of stale air. Dust swirled in the dim light. Inside, the house felt frozen in time. The furniture, draped in white sheets, sat like forgotten ghosts in the glow. Heavy wooden doors lined the hallway, leading to rooms I had yet to explore. Above me, a grand staircase spiraled toward the second floor, its banister coated in a thick layer of dust. Chandeliers hung from the ceiling, their crystals dulled with cobwebs. The atmosphere felt oppressive, as if the walls themselves held memories too heavy to let go. I pushed aside the unease, telling myself it was only the isolation playing tricks on my mind. The first room I explored was the study. Bookshelves lined the walls, packed with leather-bound tomes, their spines cracked with age. Some were in English, others in languages I couldn't recognize. One, resting on the desk, caught my attention. Its pages were filled with careful handwriting, an ancestor's personal journal, perhaps. I made a mental note to examine it later. Across the hall was the dining room, where an enormous mirror, draped in a heavy cloth, stood against the far wall. It was odd, too large to simply be decorative. Something about it unsettled me. I considered pulling the cover away, but the moment passed. Another time. As I moved through the house, a sensation settled over me, a feeling of being watched. I turned more than once, expecting to see someone standing in the doorway. Each time, there was nothing. Just the empty hallways and the quiet hush of dust settling in forgotten corners. I told myself it was nothing. Just the strangeness of an unfamiliar house, its silence too deep, its history too heavy. But I couldn't shake the feeling. The first time I noticed the mirror, it was nearly midnight. I had spent the evening sorting through old papers in the study, trying to piece together the history of my family estate. The work was tedious, and by the time I decided to call it a night, my eyes were aching from the dim candlelight. As I passed by the dining room on my way upstairs, something caught my attention. The sheet covering the large mirror had slipped. It wasn't much, just a few inches, but enough to expose a sliver of the glass. In the faint glow from the hallway, I could see my own reflection, slightly distorted in the uneven surface. As I glanced at it, a flicker of movement caught my eye. Something shifted behind me. I spun around instinctively, my breath catching in my throat. But the room was empty. Just the heavy wooden chairs, the long dining table, and the deep shadows that clung to the corners. I exhaled, shaking my head. Fatigue. That's all it was. A trick of the light, a tired mind playing games. Still, I hesitated before moving on, my gaze lingering on the mirror. The longer I stared, the more it felt like something was just out of sight, watching from beyond the glass. I pulled the sheet back into place and walked away, ignoring the way my skin prickled. The next day, I turned to research. If I was going to spend the foreseeable future in this house, I needed to know more about it. The study seemed like the best place to start. I had already seen the shelves filled with old books, but now I took my time, scanning the spines until I found something personal. A worn leather journal, its cover cracked with age. The name inside the front page sent a chill down my spine. Henry Whitaker, my great-grandfather. The handwriting was neat, careful, but as I flipped through the pages, it grew more erratic. At first, the entries were ordinary, notes on estate management, the weather, letters received. But as I read on, the tone changed. There are watchers in the glass. My fingers tightened around the book. Henry wrote about strange occurrences, reflections that moved when no one else did, glimpses of figures that vanished when looked at directly. He described how previous residents had covered every mirror in the house, fearing that the reflections did not always behave as they should. One passage stood out, dated just months before Henry's final entry. We were never meant to look, never meant to let them see us. They're always watching, waiting for someone to let them out. The words sent a shiver down my spine. I closed the journal, suddenly aware of how quiet the house had become. The stillness pressed against my ears, heavy and unnatural. I told myself it was just an old man's ramblings. Superstitions passed down through the years, but something about it felt too real. That night, I awoke to whispers. I wasn't sure at first if I had imagined them. Soft, hushed voices that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. I held my breath, listening. The sound wasn't coming from the hallway or the floors below. It was coming from inside my room. I sat up, my pulse hammering in my ears. The air felt thick, pressing down on my chest. My eyes darted across the darkness until they landed on the closet. The door was slightly open, just enough to reveal the small vanity mirror inside. In the reflection, something stood in the corner of my room. Not a person, just a shape, tall and unmoving, wrapped in shadows. My breath caught in my throat. I forced myself to turn my head, to look directly at the corner. Nothing. I snapped my gaze back to the mirror. The shape was still there. A cold dread settled in my stomach. Moving quickly, I stumbled out of bed, grabbed the nearest blanket, and threw it over the mirror. My hands were shaking. The room was silent again, but my heart still pounded in my chest. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The disturbances worsened over the next few days. It started with small things, subtle shifts and reflections, movements that didn't feel quite right. The first time I noticed it, I was passing the hallway mirror on my way downstairs. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my shadow stretching long behind me. But there was another shadow just beside mine. Too close. Too still. I stopped and turned, expecting to see something behind me. But the hallway was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, there was only my own reflection. My skin prickled. In the bathroom, the sensation returned. I stood at the sink, splashing cold water on my face, trying to shake the heavy exhaustion that had settled over me. When I looked up, I caught something strange. My reflection hesitated for a fraction of a second before mirroring my movements. I blinked, convinced I had imagined it. I tested it again, raising my left hand, then my right. The reflection followed perfectly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, not just by my own eyes, but by something deeper within the glass. By the fourth night, my patience ran out. I decided to face the dining room mirror. I walked into the dark room, the air thick with dust and silence. The covered mirror loomed against the far wall, the heavy cloth draped over it like a burial shroud. My pulse quickened as I grabbed the fabric and pulled. The sheet fell to the floor. At first, my reflection was normal, just my own tired face staring back at me. My breathing slowed. Maybe it was all in my head. Maybe the stories, the strange coincidences, the sleepless nights had made me paranoid. Then my reflection moved. It turned to face me a full second before I did. A cold chill washed over me. I took a step back, but in the mirror, my reflection stood still, staring. The longer I looked, the less it resembled me. The expression was wrong, too hollow, too knowing. I couldn't take it. I threw the sheet back over the mirror and left the room, my heart hammering in my chest. I needed answers. The next morning, I drove to the nearest town, a small, quiet place with a single main street. I found an antique shop that looked as old as Whitaker House itself, its windows filled with aged trinkets and faded books. An elderly man sat behind the counter, hunched over a newspaper. When I mentioned the Whitaker estate, he lowered the paper slowly, his face lined with something between recognition and fear. I was wondering if you knew anything about the house, I said. About its history. He studied me for a long moment before speaking. You're the one staying there? I nodded. He sighed, rubbing his temple. That house should have been abandoned for good. It's been cursed for generations. The word curse sent a cold weight into my stomach. What do you mean? The man hesitated before standing and pulling a worn book from a shelf behind him. He flipped through the pages until he found a yellowed newspaper clipping. He slid it across the counter to me. The headline read, Henry Whitaker found dead in mansion, face frozen in horror. My mouth went dry. The old man tapped the article. Henry was obsessed with strange rituals. Collected books no one should be reading. He believed he could trap spirits inside mirrors. Said they were dangerous, but he had a way to bind them. Some kind of ritual. I swallowed hard. Did it work? The man's expression darkened. Not the way you wanted. He didn't trap them. He let them take control. He gestured to the newspaper. They found him sitting in front of that big mirror in the dining room, staring into it like he'd seen something that broke him. A cold sweat prickled at my skin. I had looked into that same mirror. That night, I made a decision. I couldn't live in a house full of unseen watchers. If the mirrors were their connection, I needed to break it. I started with a small mirror in the study. I picked it up, my hands trembling slightly, and threw it against the floor. The glass shattered with a sharp, ringing crack. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the entire house trembled. A deep, guttural sound filled the air, a vibration that I felt in my bones. Every mirror in the house began to rattle violently, as if something trapped inside was trying to break free. And then, the whispers began. Not soft and distant like before, but loud, dozens of voices speaking at once, overlapping, incomprehensible. The sound came from everywhere. From the walls, from the ceiling, from the shattered glass at my feet. I looked down. In the broken shards of the mirror, dozens of eyes stared back at me. Not reflections, eyes. Watching. Blinking. The whispers rose into a deafening chorus, the house shaking with their rage. The lights flickered, then died, plunging everything into darkness. I wasn't alone. Something had woken up. And it was coming. That night, I woke to the sound of creaking wood. At first, I thought it was the house settling, the way old buildings groan in the dead of night. But then I heard something else, a rustling, like fabric shifting, slow and deliberate. I sat up, my body tense. My breath came shallow, my pulse hammering in my ears. The door to the dining room was open. My stomach dropped. I had closed it before going to bed. I was sure of it, but now it stood ajar, revealing the darkened room beyond. And worse, the sheet covering the mirror was gone. I didn't remember uncovering it. I didn't even remember touching it since the last time. But there it was, fully exposed, its surface rippling like disturbed water. Then something moved inside it. Not a reflection. Something stepping through. I barely registered what I was seeing, shape-shifting in the glass, elongated figures emerging from its surface like they were pushing through a thin membrane. Their forms were stretched, flickering like static, their limbs too long, their heads tilting at impossible angles. They weren't human. The first figure stepped onto the wooden floor, its movements jerky, as if it hadn't yet figured out how to move in this world. Its face was blurred, shifting, changing, sometimes featureless, sometimes too detailed. The others followed, crawling, stumbling, forcing themselves free of the glass. And they were looking at me. I turned to run, but my breath caught in my throat. Every mirror in the house had come to life. My own reflection blocked my path, dozens of them, staring from every surface. The hallway mirror, the shards of broken glass in the study, the small vanity in the bedroom. And they weren't following my movements anymore. They were standing still, watching. Then, all at once, they smiled. Panic surged through me. I stumbled backward, my thoughts racing. There was no way out. They were everywhere. The air had grown thick, heavy, pressing in around me. The figures from the dining room mirror took slow, deliberate steps forward. I remembered Henry's journal, his final warning. They are bound by reflection, but they fear true darkness. Darkness. I didn't have time to think. I turned, grabbed the closest heavy object, a chair, and hurled it at the dining room mirror. The impact shattered the glass with a deafening crack. Everything collapsed into darkness. The moment the mirror broke, the house screamed. Not just the whispers, a chorus of agony. The walls trembled, the air pulsed with something unseen, and the figures in the mirror let out unearthly, distorted shrieks. Their bodies warped, bending in on themselves, their flickering forms twisting as if being pulled backward into nothingness. The rattling grew unbearable, the pressure in the room so intense I thought my skull would split. One by one, the figures began to vanish, dragged into the shattered void where the mirror once stood. I dropped to my knees, hands over my ears, trying to shut out the sound. Then, silence. I don't know how long I stayed on the floor. When I finally opened my eyes, the house was still. The air was cold, unmoving. I slowly got to my feet. The mirrors were empty again. No shadows, no distortions, no watchers. Still trembling, I moved through the house, covering every mirror I could find. The ones that weren't already shattered, I boarded up. I left only one small handheld mirror, placing it on the table in front of me. A test. I took a deep breath and looked into it. At first, everything was normal. My own exhausted face staring back at me, my eyes sunken from sleepless nights. I exhaled. Maybe it was over. Then, just for a fraction of a second, my reflection didn't move. It watched me. And then, slowly, it caught up. I set the mirror down carefully, my hands steady despite the ice creeping through my veins. The watchers were gone, but not forever. I didn't stay in the house after that night. At sunrise, I packed my things, only what I could carry, and walked out the front door without looking back. The mirrors were covered, the house left in silence. Whatever I had disturbed, whatever had watched me from the glass, I had no intention of giving it another chance. Within a week, I put the Whitaker estate up for sale. The listing agent asked why I was selling so soon. I didn't answer. There was no way to explain what had happened without sounding insane. The house sat on the market for months before someone finally bought it, a developer planning to renovate and resell it. I signed the paperwork without hesitation. Once the deed was transferred, I told myself it was over. I told myself I was free. A month later, I was walking through the city, running errands, enjoying the noise and life of civilization after so much time in isolation. Then, as I passed a storefront, something caught my eye. A reflection. It was just me, standing in the glass, surrounded by the busy street. But something was wrong. I stopped. The people around me moved normally, their reflections matching their every step. But my own reflection, it didn't blink. A chill ran through me. I stared at myself, waiting, testing it. Slowly, too slowly, my reflection raised its hand to match mine. I stumbled backward, my breath caught in my throat. When I looked again, everything was normal, but I knew what I had seen. The watchers were not gone. They were waiting. I never thought I'd end up here. A small townhouse in a quiet neighborhood, far from the life I used to know. The divorce had taken everything. The house, the car, even the dog. So, when I found this place, I took it without hesitation. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. The townhouse was modest, 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a living room that felt empty with just a couch and a TV. A low wooden fence separated my backyard from the one next door. It wasn't much, but I liked the idea of having some space to myself. For the first time in years, I could do what I wanted without having to answer to anyone. The neighborhood was quiet, mostly families and retirees. It wasn't the kind of place where people threw wild parties or had loud arguments on the front lawn. That was part of the appeal: peace, privacy, and a fresh start. But one thing stood out almost immediately: the house next door. At night, the windows were always lit, a pale glow leaking through the curtains at all hours. I'd wake up at 2 or 3 a.m. to get a glass of water and see the same dim light burning through the gaps. It wasn't just one room either. Sometimes the upstairs window, sometimes the downstairs living room. Occasionally, shadows moved behind the curtains, long and distorted. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe my neighbors were night owls. Maybe they worked late or had trouble sleeping. It wasn't my business, and I had my own problems to deal with. Then came the first weekend. It started with music, loud, thumping bass shaking my walls at midnight. Laughter, too, wild and slurred, drifting over the fence. I heard bottles clinking, chairs scraping against concrete. I tried to ignore it. I turned up the TV, pulled the pillow over my head, told myself they'd quiet down soon. But it went on for hours, well into the early morning. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I fell asleep. The next morning, I stepped into my backyard, hoping for some fresh air and quiet. Instead, I found the aftermath of a drunken storm. Beer cans littered their patio. Chairs were knocked over. Cigarette butts were ground into the pavement. A half-empty bottle of whiskey lay tipped over by the fence, its contents soaked into the dirt. I sighed. It wasn't the end of the world, just a wild Saturday night. Maybe they were young, enjoying their weekend. I'd been there once too. Still, something about it unsettled me. Maybe it was the fact that I had never actually seen my neighbors. Not once. Not when I moved in. Not when I stepped outside. Not even during the party. Just the lights. And the shadows behind the curtains. The party was just the beginning. The following nights were quieter, but in a way that felt worse. Like the kind of quiet that carried weight. The kind that made you listen harder, straining for something just beneath the surface. I started hearing voices. Low, muffled arguing from the house next door. Sometimes it was a man, other times a woman. The words were never clear, but the tone was sharp, short, cutting sentences, voices teetering on the edge of a scream. Then, one night, something different. A loud crash, followed by silence. Not the kind of sound you could mistake for anything else. Something heavy had hit the floor, or maybe been thrown. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, waiting to hear what came next. But nothing did. No more voices. No movement. Just silence stretching out like a held breath. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I stepped outside to take my trash to the curb. A couple of the older neighbors stood near the sidewalk, speaking in hushed voices. Middle of the night. Didn't see who. Ambulance, no sirens. I slowed my pace, pretending to adjust the lid of my trash bin, hoping to catch more. One of the women glanced my way, her lips pressing into a thin line before she looked away. An ambulance. Had something happen next door? I didn't know what to think, but I reminded myself that it wasn't my business. People had their own lives, their own problems. I wasn't here to get involved. That was easier said than done. It started with a feeling. Not fear, not at first. Just unease. That strange awareness that prickled at the back of my neck. The kind that makes you turn around even when you know no one's there. At first, I told myself I was being stupid. It was just the stress of moving, of being alone in a new place. Then I noticed the cigarette butts scattered near my back steps, as if someone had stood there for a long time, smoking and watching. I didn't smoke. One night, while brushing my teeth, I turned off the bathroom light and glanced out the window. My backyard was dark, but my eyes caught a flicker of movement near the fence. A shadow. Not just any shadow. A person, standing near the fence line, barely visible in the dim light. I froze, heart hammering. The figure didn't move for a long moment. Then, as if sensing my gaze, it shifted, slow, deliberate. I shut the blinds. I didn't check again. At 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of footsteps outside my window. Not the rustling of an animal, not the creak of the house settling. Human footsteps. I held my breath, straining to listen. They moved slowly, deliberately, like someone trying not to be heard. A shadow passed across my bedroom window. My stomach twisted. I sat up, pulse hammering in my ears, and reached for my phone. I hovered over the call button, debating whether I was overreacting. Then, just as suddenly as they had come, the footsteps stopped. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The first direct encounter came a few days later. The night was cold, the wind sharp against the windows. I was watching TV, trying to distract myself, when I heard it. Soft tapping on my back door. Not knocking. Tapping. Gentle. Almost playful. I turned off the TV. The room was silent now, save for my own breathing. Tap. 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 I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to move. Slowly, carefully, I approached the door. Through the peephole, I saw nothing but darkness. I swallowed hard. When I finally worked up the nerve to open it, the backyard was empty. No footprints on the porch, no sign of anyone. But later, when I checked the fence, I found it. A fresh boot print in the damp soil. Facing my house. I met her by accident. It was late afternoon, the sun slipping toward the horizon, when I stepped out to take my trash to the curb. The wind had a sharp bite, and the air smelled faintly of rain. As I reached the sidewalk, I saw her. She stood by her own trash bin, barely visible in the fading light. A thin woman, wrapped in a too large sweater, her dark hair hanging limp around her face. For a moment, we just looked at each other. "Hey," I said, hesitating. You're my neighbor, right?" She nodded, but said nothing. Up close, she looked worn, pale, exhausted. There were dark circles under her eyes, her skin almost colorless. Something about her posture made my stomach twist, like she wanted to fold in on herself, disappear entirely. "I'm Ethan," I offered. I saw an ambulance here the other night. Is everything okay?" Her eyes flickered up to mine for just a second. Then she whispered, "He's gone." A chill ran through me. Before I could ask what she meant, she turned away, hurrying back toward her house. I watched as she slipped inside and shut the door behind her. I waited, expecting to see the glow of her lights through the curtains. But her house remained dark. That night, I realized something was different. The noise was gone. No music, no arguing, no muffled voices drifting through the walls. For the first time since I moved in, the house next door was silent. Completely, oppressively silent. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling that silence press in around me. It should have been a relief, but it wasn't. It was wrong. I rolled onto my side, glancing toward the window. The lights next door were off. Not just dimmed, off. Pitch black. That had never happened before. For hours, I listened, waiting for something, anything, to break the silence. But nothing came. It was the longest night of my life. At 3 a.m., the scratching woke me. A slow, deliberate sound, like nails dragging against glass. I sat up too fast, my pulse spiking. The room was dark, the air heavy. I held my breath, listening. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It was coming from my back window. I forced myself to move, my limbs stiff with dread. Slowly, I reached for the blinds, my fingers trembling as I lifted them just an inch. And I saw him. A man stood near the fence, half hidden in shadow. Tall, motionless, staring straight at my window. My throat went dry. He wasn't moving, wasn't shifting his weight, wasn't even swaying in the wind. Just standing there, watching. Minutes passed. My heart pounded so loudly I thought he might hear it. I reached for the light switch. My fingers fumbled against the wall, then Click. The porch light flooded the yard. The figure was gone. I sucked in a sharp breath, my skin crawling. I scanned the yard, my vision darting between the fence and the empty space where he had stood. Nothing. No sound. No movement. Then I saw it. A single, wet footprint on the pavement, facing my house. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I needed answers. The next morning, I decided to talk to the neighbors. Someone had to know something. Maybe they'd seen the man. Maybe they'd heard something about the house next door. Anything would help. But the moment I mentioned it, their expressions changed. Mrs. Dalton, the elderly woman across the street, fidgeted with the sleeves of her cardigan. "I don't know anything about that house, dear." She wouldn't meet my eyes. Mr. Holloway, the retired firefighter who lived 2 doors down, let out a breath through his nose and muttered, "Best to leave it alone." They all had the same reaction, unease, avoidance, as if just talking about it was dangerous. That night, I went online, digging through real estate records. Nothing. No sale history. No rental listings. No tax records. As if the house didn't officially exist. My paranoia deepened. I started locking every door twice, keeping the curtains drawn at all times, sleeping with a kitchen knife under my pillow. I told myself I was being ridiculous. But at 3 a.m., everything changed. It started with a sound. A low creak, so soft I almost didn't catch it. My back gate. I bolted upright, my pulse slamming against my ribs. The room was dark, the air too still. I strained my ears, waiting. Then, another creak. The unmistakable groan of wood shifting. Someone was in my backyard. Adrenaline took over. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand, barely thinking. My hands shook as I crept toward the sliding glass door. The backyard was pitch black. The wind had died, and the silence was suffocating. I flicked on the flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. And then I saw him, standing just beyond the fence. The same figure. This time, I saw his face. Pale, too pale, like skin stretched thin over bone. Hollow eyes, sunken deep into his skull. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Just a faint, rapid movement, like he was whispering to something unseen. A cold wave of dread crashed over me. Then, in an instant, he moved. Not walked. Rushed. A sudden, jerking lunge toward me. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. My heart slammed against my ribs as I scrambled inside, slamming the door shut. My breath came in ragged gasps as I locked it, my fingers fumbling. The backyard was empty again, but I knew he had been there. The next morning, something was different. The air felt heavier, the silence too deep. Then I saw them. Handprints. Faint outlines smeared across my back window, as if someone had pressed their palms there for hours. Dread pooled in my stomach. I had installed a security camera a few days earlier, just in case. Now, with shaking fingers, I pulled up the footage. At first, everything was normal. The night stretched on, quiet and uneventful. Then, at 3 a.m., the screen flickered. Static. It lasted only a few seconds. Then, a single frame. A blurred figure, skeletal and distorted, staring directly into the lens. And then, nothing. Just darkness. I couldn't stay. Not after the handprints. Not after the footage. Not after the feeling that, every time I closed my eyes, something watched. I packed my bags in a frenzy, stuffing clothes and essentials into a duffel. I didn't care where I went, just away. A cheap motel on the edge of town would do. As I stepped outside, duffel slung over my shoulder, I froze. Lena was standing in her doorway. She looked worse than before, pale as death, her hollow eyes locked onto mine. She didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, as if she had been waiting. Then she whispered, "He doesn't like it when people notice him." A chill swept through me. My mouth opened, but no words came. And before I could even process what she had said, her door closed on its own. Slow, silent, like something unseen had pushed it shut. I didn't wait to see if it would open again. I got in my car and left. At the motel, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept circling back to what Lena had said. He doesn't like it when people notice him. Who was he? I needed answers. By morning, I was at the town records office, digging through anything I could find. Eventually, I came across a police report, an old one, buried in the archives. I skimmed the details, my breath catching in my throat. The house next door had been the site of a brutal domestic murder years ago. The previous tenant, a violent man, had been found dead in the backyard. His body was twisted unnaturally, his face frozen in pure terror. The official cause of death? Unknown. The case had never been solved. The only witness, his wife, had gone missing shortly after. My hands shook as I closed the file. I knew now. The shadow, the whispers, the figure in the yard. He never left. That night, I packed everything I owned and loaded it into my car. I wasn't coming back. As I pulled out of the driveway, I took one last look at the house, and my stomach dropped. A shadow stood in my bedroom window, tall, motionless, watching, but it wasn't just standing there. It was facing me. Even from a distance, I could tell. It knew I was leaving. I slammed my foot on the gas and tore down the street, not daring to look back. I never returned. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I still feel it. That weight in the air, that whisper of breath against the back of my neck, that feeling that someone is standing just behind me, watching, waiting. I never believed in ghosts. Even now, looking back, I struggled to convince myself that what I saw was real. My father, Richard, would scoff if I ever told him. He was the kind of man who believed in hard facts, what he could see, touch, and explain. The world, to him, was a place of logic. But some things defy logic, don't they? I had just moved back into my childhood home, a creaking two-story house that had been in my family for generations. The house belonged to my grandparents before they passed, and my father never had the heart to sell it. It was old, the kind of place where dust never fully settled, where the walls seemed to breathe with the shifting air. The long, narrow hallway leading to the bedrooms was the worst part of it. No matter how many times I walked down it as a child, I always felt like something was watching me from the darkness beyond the antique mirror that had hung there for decades. That mirror was massive, its gilded edges tarnished with time. It had been there since my grandparents were young, and no one ever moved it. My father called it a family heirloom, but I had always found it unsettling. It was the kind of mirror that seemed to swallow reflections, making the hallway feel even more oppressive than it already was. The air inside the house was thick, carrying the scent of aged wood, dust, and something else, something I could never quite place. Maybe it was just the weight of old memories of a house that had seen generations come and go. My first night back, I struggled to sleep. The house was quiet, except for the occasional groan of wood settling, the kind of noises you expect in an old building. I wasn't scared. Not yet. But around midnight, my body woke me up, demanding a trip to the bathroom. The hallway was dark, except for the dim glow of a single bulb flickering near the ceiling. The air felt unusually heavy as I stepped into the corridor, my bare feet pressing against the cool wooden floor. I was halfway to the bathroom when I saw it. A shadow. It moved along the wall, elongated and distorted. For a split second, I thought it was mine, but the angles didn't match. It was taller, its limbs too long, its head tilted in a way that made my stomach tighten. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. And then, it was gone. I stood there for a moment, heart pounding, staring at the spot where the shadow had been. The flickering light above me buzzed once, then steadied. My mind scrambled for an explanation, maybe a trick of the light, maybe I was still half asleep. Shaking my head, I forced myself to move. I blamed it on exhaustion, on old bulbs, on anything but what it truly was. I should have known better. The next morning over coffee, I mentioned the shadow to my father. "You probably need more sleep," he said without looking up from his newspaper. "I know what I saw," I insisted. He let out a dry chuckle. "This house is old, Michael. Old houses make shadows, creak, settle. You're acting like a kid afraid of the dark." I wanted to push back, but I knew it was pointless. My father had never been the kind of man to indulge in superstition. If something couldn't be explained by logic, then it didn't exist. But things kept happening. At first, it was small. At night, when the house should have been still, I'd hear them, soft, dragging footsteps in the hallway, like someone shuffling across the wooden floor in socks. Slow, unhurried. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, my ears straining to make sense of the sound. More than once, I got up and checked, expecting to find my father awake, but his bedroom door was always shut. And when I stepped into the hallway, the sound would stop. Then there were the doors. Every night before bed, my father would go around the house, making sure everything was locked and shut. It was a habit of his. He didn't trust old houses not to let the wind push things open. But in the mornings, I started noticing things were off. Doors that had been closed were open just an inch or two. "Dad, did you leave the basement door open last night?" I asked one morning. He barely glanced up from his coffee. "Nope." "Well, it was open when I woke up." He shook his head, setting his mug down. "Michael, doors shift. You think everything stays in place in an old house? Drafts, weak latches, whatever." But the thing was, there was no draft. The air in the house was heavy, still. In the hallway, it was always cold. Not a normal kind of cold. It wasn't like the chill of a winter morning or the cool air from an open window. It was sharp, biting, unnatural. It could be warm in every other part of the house, but the second I stepped into that narrow corridor, a shiver would crawl up my spine. Then came the mirror. It happened one evening. My father had gone out for the night, leaving me alone in the house. I was walking past the antique mirror in the hallway when something made me stop. A flicker of movement. I turned back, staring into the glass. At first, all I saw was my own reflection, dimly lit by the hallway light. But then, there was something else. At the far end of the corridor, deep within the reflection, stood a figure. Tall. Too tall. Its body was thin, almost stretched. Its arms hung unnaturally at its sides, and where its eyes should have been, there were only dark, hollow pits. I sucked in a breath and spun around. Nothing. The hallway was empty. But when I turned back to the mirror, the figure was still there. Standing, watching. A cold wave of fear crashed over me. My hands trembled as I forced myself to look away and move. My heart pounded so hard it hurt, my breath coming fast and shallow. I locked myself in my room, sitting on the edge of the bed, trying to convince myself that I hadn't really seen it. That night, I barely slept. The next morning, I told my father about the mirror. He let out a sharp laugh. "Michael, for God's sake, do you think ghosts live in mirrors now?" I clenched my jaw. "I know what I saw." He sighed, rubbing his temples. "You've been stressed, that's all. You're overthinking things. Maybe you should get out of the house more." He wasn't going to believe me. No matter what I said, no matter how real it felt, he would always find a way to explain it away. But I knew something was wrong with this house, and it was watching me. Richard had always been the type of man who dismissed fear. He wasn't the kind to get rattled by creaky floorboards or flickering lights. He believed in solid things, locks, walls, and the certainty of his own senses. That changed on a cold, still night when he woke up with a dry throat and decided to get a glass of water. The house was silent as he stepped into the hallway, the wooden floor cool beneath his feet. The air was heavier than usual, thick with something he couldn't name. The dim glow from the old hallway bulb cast long shadows, making the corridor seem even narrower than it was. As he passed the antique mirror, something caught his eye. A shape. At first, he thought it was Michael. A figure hunched over, standing too close to the glass. But as his sleep-fogged mind cleared, he realized this wasn't his son. It was a woman, gaunt, pale. Her long, wet-looking hair clung to her face, strands curling against her sunken cheeks. Her thin arms were pressed against the mirror, fingers splayed out, nails dragging lightly over the glass with a sound like a whisper. Richard stopped breathing. The woman's lips moved, forming words with no sound. Her eyes, dark, empty pits, were locked onto her own reflection. A chill wrapped around Richard's spine like an icy hand. Then, in the blink of an eye, she was gone. The hallway was empty. The mirror reflected only Richard's own pale, shaken face. For a long moment, he just stood there, his heart pounding so loudly he could hear it in his ears. "Jesus Christ," he muttered under his breath, running a hand over his face. It had to have been a trick of the mind. He was half asleep, probably still dreaming. Maybe it was the way the light played against the glass, or maybe, just maybe, he was getting too old for this house. Shaking his head, he forced himself to move. He got his glass of water, returned to his room, and lay in bed staring at the ceiling. But sleep never came, and the cold that had wrapped around him never really left. The next night, the house reached its breaking point. Richard had been tossing and turning, unable to shake the memory of what he had seen in the mirror. Across the hall, Michael was awake too, lying in bed, staring at his bedroom door. The air in the house felt wrong, like a pressure building just beneath the surface. Then, at exactly 3 a.m., bang, every door in the hallway slammed shut at the same time. The sound was deafening, like a gunshot echoing through the old house. Michael shot upright in bed, his pulse hammering. He could hear the walls groan, as if the house itself had taken a breath. Heart pounding, he scrambled out of bed and yanked his door open. His father was already standing in the hallway, his face pale, his eyes wide with something Michael had never seen before: fear. They stared at each other for a long moment, the silence after the slams ringing in their ears. "Did you hear that?" Michael whispered. Richard didn't answer. For the first time in his life, he had no explanation. Neither of us slept after that night. The silence between my father and me the next morning was thick, heavier than the air in the hallway. He didn't say anything about what had happened, but I could see it in his face. He had no explanation, and that terrified him more than the event itself. I had to know what we were dealing with. That day, I started digging into the house's history. I searched online, but information was scarce. The house had been in our family for a long time, passed down through generations, but before that, there wasn't much. I decided to check the local library archives, hoping to find old property records or news articles. After an hour of scrolling through microfilm, something caught my eye: an old, yellowed newspaper clipping from the late 1950s. Local woman found dead in family home, body marked with strange wounds. My stomach twisted as I read. Her name was Eleanor Hayes. She had lived alone in this house for years after her husband died. The article described how she was found one morning, collapsed in the hallway, her face frozen in terror. The cause of death was never officially determined, but the most unsettling part was the state of her body. Her arms, neck, and back were covered in deep scratches, as if she had been clawing at herself, or as if something else had clawed at her. I swallowed hard and kept reading. Neighbors had reported strange behavior in the months leading up to her death. Eleanor had become obsessed with the hallway mirror, speaking to it as if someone were there. She told people she wasn't alone in the house, that something was watching her. "I know you're watching," she had whispered once to a visitor, staring into the glass. A chill ran down my spine. I shut the records and left the library, my hands cold and clammy. When I got back home, I found my father sitting at the kitchen table, barely touching his coffee. He looked up at me, his eyes dark and tired. "What are you up to?" he asked. "I found something," I said. I told him about Eleanor, about the way she had died, about what she had claimed to see in the mirror. He didn't interrupt me, didn't roll his eyes or scoff like he normally would have. When I finished, he just sat there, gripping his mug so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Jesus," he muttered. That was all he said. That evening, I went up to the attic. It had been years since anyone had been up there. Dust covered everything, thick and undisturbed. The single hanging bulb cast long shadows over old trunks, forgotten furniture, and stacks of yellowed newspapers. The air was stale, filled with the scent of time and neglect. I didn't know what I was looking for until I found it. A small wooden box, half buried under an old sheet. I pulled it out, my heart hammering. When I opened it, I found a collection of personal items, faded photographs, a delicate locket, and a worn leather journal. The name Eleanor Hayes was written inside the cover. I flipped through the pages. At first, the entries were normal. Daily thoughts, small details of her life. But as I read on, the handwriting became erratic, the sentences scrambled and desperate. It watches from the mirror. It knows when I look. It knows when I turn away. I hear it whisper when the house is silent. It moves when I'm not watching. I see it in the glass. The last entry sent ice through my veins. Scrawled across the entire page, in shaky, uneven handwriting, were the words. "It wants me to stay. It doesn't want me to leave. If you see it, don't look too long." I closed the journal, my hands shaking. Something terrible had happened to Eleanor. And now it was happening to us. We couldn't live like this anymore. After reading Eleanor's journal, my father and I sat in tense silence at the kitchen table, neither of us wanting to say what we both knew. We had to do something. That evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, we decided to cover the mirror. I grabbed an old bedsheet from the linen closet while my father stood in the hallway, arms crossed, jaw tight. When I stepped up to the mirror, I hesitated. Even covered in dust, even beneath the dim yellow glow of the hallway light, the glass still felt alive. My father must have noticed my hesitation. "Let's just get it over with," he muttered. Together, we draped the sheet over the mirror, securing it with duct tape along the edges. The fabric clung awkwardly, shifting slightly as if a breeze had passed through, but the air was completely still. I exhaled, stepping back. "Let's see if that does anything," my father said, though he didn't sound convinced. Neither was I. At exactly 3 a.m., the house shook with a violent crash. I bolted upright in bed, heart hammering. For a second, I thought it was a dream until I heard my father's door fly open. I scrambled out of bed and ran into the hallway. The mirror was on the floor, shattered into countless jagged pieces. The sheet lay crumpled to the side, as if something had torn it away. "Michael," my father's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. I looked down. In the broken shards of glass, I saw her, Eleanor. But not just one reflection, dozens of her, scattered in the fragments, each one distorted in a different way. In some, her mouth was stretched too wide, as if she were screaming. In others, her eyes were black voids. Her hands clawed at the glass from the inside, her fingers elongated and desperate. I stumbled back, while rising in my throat. Then, the temperature in the hallway plummeted. I gasped as icy air filled my lungs, and when I exhaled, my breath curled in front of me in a thin mist. The light above us flickered violently. The shadows along the walls moved, not like the shifting of a flame, but with purpose. They flickered unnaturally fast, darting from one end of the hallway to the other. A whisper slithered through the air, indistinct at first, like the wind through cracked windows. But it grew, layering upon itself, multiplying until it became something more. Something human. "Get out." The words weren't spoken. They were breathed into existence, crawling through the walls, rattling the floor beneath us. Then I screamed. It was deafening, splitting through the house like a living thing. The walls trembled, the ceiling groaned. The doors, every single one, began to shake violently. Bang, 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 as if something or someone was trying to break through from the other side. I pressed myself against the wall, my pulse wild and frantic. My father stood frozen, his fists clenched, his face drained of color. The shadows twisted, forming long, grasping fingers that reached toward us. The whispering returned, an urgent, desperate sound, like hundreds of voices overlapping in agony. And then, I made the mistake of looking down. In the largest shard of broken glass, Eleanor was still there. But she wasn't alone. Behind her, barely visible in the fractured reflection, stood it. A figure taller than any human, its body elongated, its arms stretching in unnatural angles. It had no face, only a smooth, featureless void where its head should have been. And yet, I felt it looking at me. Its long fingers dug into Eleanor's shoulders, holding her in place. She trembled beneath its grip, her hollow eyes filled with terror. As I watched, it slowly turned its head, not toward Eleanor, toward me. My stomach dropped. My skin crawled with an unbearable sense of wrongness. It saw me. It knew I was watching. The whispering voices swelled, rising into an unbearable cacophony. The hallway lights flickered wildly, casting long, distorted shadows that didn't match our movements. The doors shuttered one last time, then burst open all at once. The force knocked us backward. My head hit the floor, stars exploding in my vision. And then, everything went silent. We didn't talk about it. Not when the sun rose. Not when we packed our bags in stiff, hurried silence. Not when we carried only what we could fit into the trunk of my father's car, leaving behind furniture, memories, the house itself. My father didn't argue when I said we needed to go. He just nodded, his face hollow, his hands trembling as he loaded the last bag. By the time we pulled out of the driveway, the house stood quiet, the morning light painting it in soft, deceptive warmth. It looked like nothing had ever happened, like it was just another old home, waiting for its next occupants. But I knew better. As we turned onto the main road, I made the mistake of looking into the rearview mirror. For a split second, I saw her, Eleanor, standing at the upstairs window, staring after us. Her sunken eyes empty, her expression unreadable. Then she was gone. I gripped the steering wheel tighter and forced myself to keep my eyes on the road. My father never spoke of that night. Neither did I. Months passed. We never went back. But one evening, while scrolling online, I came across a real estate listing. Charming, historic two-story home, recently renovated. Spacious rooms, original hardwood floors. Available now. My stomach turned. The photos showed the familiar rooms, cleaned up and staged with modern furniture. But one detail made my breath catch: the hallway mirror. It was different, newer, shinier, but it still hung in the exact same spot. I stared at the image for a long time, unease crawling up my spine. And then, I closed my laptop. I didn't need to see anymore, because I already knew. It's still watching, waiting for the next occupant to notice. My name is David Carter. I've always preferred the night. There's something about the quiet darkness that makes me feel at peace. Maybe it's because the world slows down and I don't have to deal with anyone. No traffic, no phone calls, no pointless conversations. Just me, a cigarette, and the stars. I live alone in a small house near the edge of town. It's nothing special. One story, a worn-out porch, and a backyard that fades into a thick forest. I don't mind the isolation. In fact, I like it. The nearest neighbors are far enough away that I can sit outside at midnight without hearing a single human sound. Just crickets, the occasional owl, and the gentle rustling of the trees when the wind picks up. Most nights, I step onto my porch around midnight, light a cigarette, and lean against the wooden railing. I take my time, letting the smoke curl into the air while I stare at the stars. The sky out here is clear, untouched by city lights. I've spent hours tracing constellations, letting my mind wander. Sometimes, I lose track of time and stay out until the embers of my cigarette burn down to my fingertips. But lately, something has changed. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. The night still looked the same. The stars still shone. The wind still moved through the trees, and the crickets still chirped. But between all of that, there was something missing. It's hard to describe. It's like a pressure in the air, something heavy sitting just out of reach. A brief silence between the usual night sounds, so subtle I almost don't notice it. Almost. The first time it happened, I brushed it off. Maybe it was just my imagination. But then it happened again, and again. A moment where everything felt wrong. I don't scare easily. I've spent too many nights out here alone to get spooked by the dark. But now, every time I step onto my porch, I can't shake the feeling that something is watching me. I tell myself it's nothing, just my mind playing tricks. But deep down, I know better. That night started like any other. It was past midnight when I stepped outside, a cigarette balanced between my fingers. The air was crisp, cool against my skin, and the sky stretched overhead in an endless black expanse, littered with stars. I leaned against the railing, taking a slow drag, exhaling smoke into the night. But something made me look up. I don't know what it was, an instinct, maybe, or just a flicker in my peripheral vision. My eyes lifted toward the sky, and that's when I saw them. 3 lights. They weren't stars. They were too bright, too sharp, and too close together. At first, I thought they were aircraft, maybe drones or helicopters. But they moved too fast, blurring across the sky in a way that didn't make sense. 1 second, they hovered in a tight triangle, and the next, they shifted positions in a way that no plane, no machine, should be able to move. I held my breath, watching. The lights didn't flicker like normal aircraft lights. They pulsed, their glow intensifying, dimming, then growing brighter again. I told myself it had to be military tests or some kind of optical illusion. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. That's when I felt it. A pressure, deep inside my skull. It wasn't a headache. It was something worse, like invisible hands pressing against my brain. Not painful, but heavy, unnatural. I swallowed, my throat dry, and then I noticed the silence. No crickets, no wind, no rustling leaves. Nothing. I'd never heard silence like that before. It was absolute, like the world had been muted. Even my breathing sounded too loud, too foreign in my own ears. The pressure in my head deepened, making my vision waver. The lights pulsed once more, and then I blinked. Just a single blink. But when I opened my eyes, the world had changed. The sky wasn't dark anymore. It was soft blue, streaked with the warm hues of dawn. The sun was rising. Birds were chirping in the distance. The air smelled different, morning dew instead of the cool crispness of night. I stood frozen, my cigarette still in my hand, barely burned. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers stiff, my mind struggling to make sense of what had happened. When I finally managed to turn on the screen, the time read 6:13 a.m. 6 hours had passed, but I had only blinked. I stood on my porch, staring at the phone screen. 6:13 a.m. That wasn't possible. I forced myself to think logically. Maybe I fell asleep standing up? That didn't make sense, but what other explanation was there? Maybe I was exhausted, and my mind had just shut off. Some kind of blackout. I checked my phone's history. No missed calls. No messages. No record of anything happening during those missing 6 hours. But then I saw the notification. It shouldn't have been there. I didn't remember setting any alarms or using any sleep tracking apps. And yet, there it was. Awake at 6:13 a.m. Are you sure it was you? I felt a cold wave roll through me. I tapped the notification, but it disappeared instantly, vanishing from the screen like it had never existed. My breath came slower now, my heartbeat heavy in my chest. Something wasn't right. Inside, my house felt different. Not in an obvious way. Everything was where it should be, or close enough. But there was a strange sense of unfamiliarity, like I was stepping into a perfect replica of my home rather than the real thing. I ran my hand along the edge of the kitchen counter. The surface was smooth and cool, just as it should be. But when I touched it, it felt wrong, like I was experiencing the texture a split second after my brain expected it. I scanned the room. My keys were on the table, but I wasn't sure if that was where I had left them. The chair at the far end of the room looked slightly angled, just enough to make me wonder if I had moved it before going outside last night. Little things, subtle things, things I would never normally notice. I told myself I was overthinking it, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But then the symptoms started. At first, it was just a feeling, something deep inside me that felt misaligned, like a bone slightly out of place, like I was not fully connected to myself. I would reach for something and hesitate, just for a fraction of a second, as if my body wasn't sure where it was supposed to be. The sensation was subtle, but it was there, always lingering at the edge of my awareness. Then came the whispers. The first time I heard them, I was in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Just as I was drifting off, a faint sound reached my ears. A voice, no, multiple voices. Muted, indistinct, just beyond my window. I sat up, my breath caught in my throat. The whispers stopped. I waited. Nothing. I forced myself to lie back down, convincing myself it was just the wind. But the next night, they came again. Closer. And then, there was the mirror. I was brushing my teeth when I noticed it. I spit, rinsed my mouth, and wiped my face with a towel. But as I lowered the towel, I saw it, just for the briefest moment. My reflection lagged. Not by much, just a fraction of a second. Just enough for my brain to register that something was wrong. I froze, staring at myself. My face was pale, my eyes tired. My reflection matched me perfectly now, but I knew what I had seen. I backed away from the mirror. For the first time in my life, I left the bathroom light on when I went to bed. The electronics were next. The TV would flicker when I walked past it, even when it was off. My phone screen would light up randomly, showing nothing but a black screen before going dark again. And then, there were the people. The first time I noticed it was at the grocery store. The cashier, a woman I had seen 100 times before, paused when she saw me. Just for a moment. Her smile faltered. It was quick, so quick that if I hadn't been watching, I wouldn't have noticed. But in that brief hesitation, there was something else. Recognition. As if she knew me. As if she expected me to be someone else. I paid for my things and left without another word. I didn't know what was happening to me, but I knew one thing for sure. I had come back wrong. The first time it happened, I was washing dishes. One moment, I was standing at my sink, scrubbing a plate. The next, I was somewhere else. A flash of memory, too vivid to be imagination, too foreign to be mine. I saw a city I had never been to. Tall buildings stretching into an overcast sky, their windows reflecting something dark, something shifting. The streets were empty. Not a single person, not a single sound. Then, faces. Dozens of them. People I didn't know, staring at me as if I was supposed to recognize them. Their expressions were blank, their eyes hollow. And just like that, I was back in my kitchen, my hands shaking under the running water. It wasn't the last time. The memories came in bursts, places, people, moments that I had never lived. I dreamt of standing in a vast, endless black void, cold and silent, with towering shadowy figures all around me. They didn't move. They only watched. And then, in one dream, a voice spoke. Not out loud. It spoke directly into my mind. You are not alone in there. I woke up gasping for air, my chest tight, my room impossibly dark. The voice still echoed in my head, deep and distant, like something pressing against the walls of my skull from the inside. A few nights later, I woke up in the forest. I was standing barefoot in the damp earth, the trees stretching high above me, their branches swaying in a slow, unnatural rhythm. The air smelled of wet leaves and something else, something metallic, something wrong. I had no memory of how I got there. I turned back toward my house, my heart hammering. But then I noticed the ground beneath me, my footprints in the mud. They only went one way. There were deep impressions leading into the trees, but none coming back out. I had walked here, but I hadn't walked back. A sharp chill ran through me. I forced myself to move, stumbling out of the woods, my breath coming fast. I locked my doors when I got inside, my hands trembling so badly I could barely turn the key. In the bathroom, I turned on the sink and splashed cold water on my face. My reflection stared back at me, wide-eyed and pale. I leaned in, gripping the edges of the sink. Then, just for a split second, my reflection didn't move. I flinched. My body jerked back. It was fast, so fast that if I hadn't been looking, I wouldn't have noticed. But I had seen it. For a brief, impossible moment, the man in the mirror had delayed, just a fraction of a second. A terrible thought crept into my mind. Was it waiting for me? Paranoia settled in after that. I stopped going outside at night. I kept the blinds shut, but the feeling never left me. The weight of unseen eyes pressing against me. The static hum of something watching, waiting. I needed proof. So I set up my phone to record myself while I slept. The first night, nothing happened. I scrolled through hours of footage, watching myself toss and turn under the covers, restless but unmoving. But on the second night, I found it. At exactly 3:33 a.m., my body sat up. Not abruptly, not like someone waking from a nightmare. It was slow, deliberate. My head turned toward the camera, and then my eyes opened. I couldn't describe the look on my own face. My eyes weren't just empty. They were absent, as if nothing was looking through them at all. I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting into knots. After a full minute, my body laid back down, pulling the covers over itself with careful precision. In the morning, I had no memory of it. I told myself it was sleepwalking. That had to be it. But deep down, I knew better. That evening, I picked up my phone to call someone, anyone. I needed to hear a familiar voice, to ground myself in something real. I called my friend Mark. The phone rang once, then twice, and then someone picked up. I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could say a word, a voice came through the speaker. It wasn't Mark. It wasn't anyone I knew. It was flat, emotionless, and it said only one thing. You are not supposed to be here, David. The line went dead. I had to know. The nightmares, the lost time, the voices. I couldn't just ignore them anymore. Something had happened to me that night. Something real. I started researching. At first, it was just general searches, lost time experiences, strange lights in the sky, missing hours. I expected nonsense. Stories about alien abductions, conspiracy theories, unverified accounts from people looking for attention. But then I found a pattern. The stories were eerily similar. People who had seen strange lights, people who had lost hours, and people who came back, different. Many of them reported feeling disconnected, like they were living in a world just slightly out of sync. Others spoke of whispers, reflections that didn't behave as they should, technology reacting strangely around them. Some even described waking up in places they had no memory of going to. The deeper I looked, the more disturbing it became, because most of these people eventually disappeared. They left behind only scattered traces, unfinished journal entries, cryptic voice recordings, messages sent to friends that made no sense. One man in Minnesota had written a final note before vanishing. I don't think I came back alone. I sat back in my chair, my skin crawling. I had been trying to convince myself that I was paranoid, that I was imagining things. But now I wasn't so sure. I wasn't sure at all. That was when I noticed it. I was getting into the shower when my fingers brushed the back of my neck. I froze. There was a scar. Small, circular, just beneath the hairline. I turned to the mirror, twisting to get a better look. It was precise, too perfect to be an accident. A small, round indentation, smooth at the edges. It hadn't been there before. I ran my fingers over it again, my breath quickening. And then, a whisper, not out loud, inside my head. A voice, distant and hollow, pressing against the edges of my mind. You were chosen. I stumbled back, my vision blurry. My heart slammed against my ribs as the words echoed, stretching out, reverberating like something vast and unseen was speaking from a place far beyond human comprehension. I gripped the sink, my hands slick with sweat. The voice faded, but the silence it left behind was worse. I needed proof, real proof. That night, I set up 3 cameras in my bedroom, one on my nightstand, one in the corner of the room, and one near the door, all aimed at different angles. I had to know what was happening to me while I slept. I took a sleeping pill to make sure I wouldn't wake up easily, then climbed into bed, staring at the ceiling. I remember thinking, right before I drifted off, that maybe I had made a mistake. Maybe some things aren't meant to be seen. The next morning, I checked the footage. The first few hours were uneventful. I lay there, still, my chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. Then, at exactly 3:33 a.m., I moved. I sat up, slowly, deliberately. I felt a sick, twisting dread watching myself in the footage. My movements were too controlled, too smooth, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. I shifted my legs over the edge of the bed and stood up. But that wasn't the worst part. On one of the cameras, the one positioned near the door, something was wrong. Because when I stood up, my shadow didn't move. It stayed where it was, pressed flat against the wall, stretching unnaturally, its shape warping slightly, as if struggling to maintain its form. And then, on the nightstand camera, my mouth began to move. No sound came out, but my lips formed silent words, as if I was speaking to someone. Asterisk, asterisk, or something. Asterisk, asterisk in the empty room. I leaned forward slightly, still speaking, my expression unreadable. Then, suddenly, I turned to face the camera, and my eyes, they weren't mine. They were black, completely black. No whites, no pupils, just deep, endless voids staring straight through the screen. I slammed the laptop shut. I could still feel those eyes on me, watching, waiting. I wasn't alone. I had never been alone. I couldn't stay. Whatever had happened to me that night, whatever I had become, it wasn't safe here. I packed a bag in silence, stuffing clothes, my laptop, and whatever cash I had into it. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get out of town. The air felt thick, pressing against my skin like a warning. I stepped outside, locking my door behind me, knowing I would never come back. As I started the car, the dashboard lights flickered weakly before stabilizing. I took a deep breath and pulled onto the road, my hands gripping the wheel too tightly. The streets were empty. The town, as silent as death. I pushed the gas pedal harder. The trees blurred past. I could see the edge of town just ahead, the road stretching into the dark, a promise of escape. Then, behind me, the streetlights flickered. One by one, they went out. First the ones behind my house, then the ones lining the road. The darkness chased me, creeping closer with each failing light. I turned on the radio to drown out the silence. Static. A faint hum buzzed through the speakers. Then, beneath the static, a voice, distorted, stretched, crawling through the frequencies. You cannot leave yourself behind. A wave of cold rolled down my spine. I turned the volume down, my breathing sharp, uneven. The road stretched ahead, endless, empty. I checked my rearview mirror and froze. Someone was sitting in my back seat. Not moving, not breathing, just there. I couldn't see their face, only their outline, the faintest suggestion of a figure in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. A cold sweat broke over my skin. I turned around. Nothing. The seat was empty. But when I turned back to the mirror, they were still there. Closer now. A vibration in my pocket. My phone. I reached for it with shaking hands, pulling it up to see the screen. A single notification. 6:13 a.m. You are awake. But are you really? The road stretched on, and the night swallowed me whole. When I bought the old building on Oakwood Street, I was only thinking about potential. The location was good, the price was unbelievably low, and despite its age, the structure was solid. The plan was simple: renovate it into office space, lease it out, and make a profit. That was the plan. The first time I stepped inside, I felt it immediately. A weight in the air. Not just the dust and the stale, untouched atmosphere of an abandoned place. It was something heavier, something that made the silence feel unnatural. The building had been empty for years. The previous owner had planned to restore it, but he never got around to it. He sold it to me cheap, mentioning only that it had too much history. I didn't ask questions. The interior showed its age. The wooden floors were worn, the wallpaper peeled at the edges, and the air smelled faintly of rot and damp wood. But what stood out most was the staircase. It was a grand thing, right in the center of the building, stretching up 3 floors. The wood was dark and polished, oddly well-maintained compared to the rest of the place. The railing was smooth under my fingers, but when I gripped it, I felt something strange, like a faint vibration, as if the stairs were alive in some way. It was the only part of the building that didn't feel completely abandoned. During the day, the space felt manageable. The sunlight filtering through the dirty windows made the place seem like any other old building in need of work. But at night, when the city quieted and the shadows grew longer, the house changed. I was alone in that building. The sounds of the street outside barely reached inside. There were no neighbors, no traffic passing by, just silence. And then, on the very first night, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from the staircase. The first time I heard the footsteps, I froze. They started from the bottom of the staircase, slow, deliberate steps. The kind of pace you take when you're deep in thought or when you know exactly where you're going. The sound was clear, impossibly clear in the otherwise silent building. The wood creaked under an unseen weight, each step measured, following a pattern. Step, step, step. I waited for a voice, for some indication that I wasn't alone. But there was nothing, just the steps, climbing higher and higher until they reached the top landing. And then, silence. I exhaled, not realizing I had been holding my breath. I checked every room, convinced that I would find someone. A trespasser, a squatter, something that made sense. But the building was empty. The dust on the floor remained undisturbed, except for my own footprints. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe the wood had shifted, settling under its own weight. That's what old buildings did, right? But then it happened again, and again. Every night, without fail, the steps would begin. Always the same pattern, always stopping at the top landing. At first, I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just the building adjusting to temperature changes. But some nights, the footsteps were slower, like someone hesitating on each step. Other nights, they were faster, almost impatient. And then the workers started noticing. I had hired a small team to help with the renovations. Contractors, electricians, people who had worked in old buildings before. They were professionals. They didn't spook easily. But after a few days, I could see it in their faces. You ever notice anything weird in here? One of them, Jason, asked casually over lunch. Weird how? I kept my tone light, waiting to see what he'd say. He hesitated. I didn't know. Just sounds. Like someone walking around. Another worker, Miguel, scoffed. It's an old place, man. With shifts, pipes settle. It's normal. Jason nodded, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. That night, I stayed late, listening. And right on schedule, the steps began again. This time, they were different. Faster. Closer. Like whatever was walking up those stairs was starting to notice me, too. By the end of the second week, I couldn't pretend it was just my imagination anymore. The footsteps weren't random noises, and they weren't the building settling. They were deliberate. They had weight, purpose, and they happened every single night. I needed answers. The first thing I did was track down the previous tenants. It wasn't hard. Most had left in a hurry, breaking their leases early. That alone told me something was wrong. I found a man named David Langston, who had run a law office on the second floor for a few years. When I mentioned the building, his response was immediate. "You bought that place?" he said, shaking his head. "Good luck with that." I asked him if he had ever heard anything unusual. His face darkened. "You mean the stairs?" he muttered. I nodded. He sighed. "Yeah, every night. Same pattern, like someone walking up and down, always stopping at the top." I tried to ignore it at first. Then I thought maybe someone was sneaking in, but the doors were always locked. I even put a security camera on the staircase. I leaned forward, and he shook his head again. Nothing. No movement. But the sound was still there, clear as day. I could see something in his expression, relief. Like he was glad it wasn't just him. Like he had spent years doubting himself. The other tenants told me the same thing. Some left after only a few months, unable to stand the feeling of being watched or the endless footsteps. One woman, Sarah, had leased the third floor as an art studio. She told me she started hearing the steps within a week of moving in. It got worse over time, she said. At first, it was just footsteps. Then I started feeling pressure, like someone was standing behind me whenever I worked late. I couldn't do it anymore. I broke my lease and left. No one had answers, only stories. I widened my search, talking to locals. That's how I ended up at a small antique shop down the street, run by an older man named Henry. "The old Oakwood building," he said, raising an eyebrow. "You mean the staircase?" That was how everyone talked about it. The staircase, as if the rest of the building didn't matter. Henry leaned on the counter. "It's always been like that. Even when I was a kid, people said there was something wrong with those stairs. Tenants came and went. No one ever stayed long." I asked him if he knew about any deaths or accidents. He shrugged. "Nothing recorded, if that's what you mean. No murders, no fires. But history isn't just what's written down." I left the shop with more questions than answers. There was no logical reason for what was happening. No tragedy, no bloodstains in the past. Just that staircase, and whatever walked it at night. I needed proof. By this point, I had spoken to enough people to know I wasn't the only one hearing the footsteps. But I still wanted something undeniable, something I could play back and analyze. Something that would confirm, without a doubt, that I wasn't losing my mind. So, one evening, I stayed late. I set up a voice recorder at the base of the staircase. No fancy ghost hunting equipment, just an ordinary recorder, the kind journalists use. If something was making noise, I would catch it. Then I waited. The building was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes your own breathing sound too loud. I sat in a chair near the stairs, phone in hand, checking the time. 7:28 p.m. I exhaled, rubbing my face. Maybe tonight would be different. Maybe whatever had been walking those stairs had lost interest. 7:30 p.m. The first step creaked. My stomach clenched. Step, step, step. The sound was unmistakable. Slow, deliberate, just like before. Moving steadily upward. I held my breath, my eyes locked on the staircase. But there was nothing there. No shifting shadows, no flicker of movement. Just sound. Step, step. The air in the room felt heavier. Like something unseen had filled the space. Like I wasn't alone. The footsteps reached the top landing. And then, silence. I forced myself to move, grabbing the recorder with shaking hands. I needed to hear it. I pressed play. The audio crackled for a moment. Then the silence of the empty building filled the speaker. Then, step, step, step. I felt my chest tighten. It was all there. The exact pattern. The same slow, deliberate climb. I rewound the tape, playing it again. And again. Each time, the steps were perfectly clear. This wasn't my imagination. It wasn't just the building settling. Someone was walking those stairs. That was when I made my biggest mistake. I decided to watch. The next night, I turned off all the lights and sat in the shadows, directly across from the staircase. No distractions, no recording devices, just me and whatever was there. At exactly 7:30 p.m., the first step creaked. Step, step, step. The air changed, like something unseen had entered the room. The pressure built, thick and suffocating, and suddenly, I felt it. Not a sound, not a sight, A presence. It was moving past me. I felt the shift in the air, a sensation like static brushing against my skin. The hair on my arms stood up, and every instinct in my body screamed at me to run. But I couldn't move. I could only sit there, breath shallow, heart pounding, as something unseen reached the top of the staircase and stopped. Waiting. Watching. I don't know how long I stayed like that. But eventually, the feeling lifted. The air lightened. The building returned to silence. And I knew, without a doubt, that I was no longer just an observer. Whatever haunted that staircase knew I was there. And now, it was aware of me. I didn't leave. Most people would have. It would have been easy to sell the building, walk away, pretend none of this had ever happened. But something about the staircase, about the presence that walked it, kept me there. I had proof. I had stories, but no answers. So, I stopped looking for them. At some point, the fear faded. The footsteps never changed. They never got closer to me, never showed any aggression. They just were. A part of the building. A rhythm as constant as the ticking of a clock. As renovations continued, the workers still heard the sounds, but no one talked about them anymore. Some shook their heads, muttering about old buildings and settling wood. Others just ignored it, turning up their radios and getting on with their work. But I listened. Every night, 7:30 p.m., the first step would creak. Step by step, it climbed to the top, paused, and then nothing. The same pattern, over and over. I stopped trying to explain it. Some nights, I would sit at my desk on the first floor, sipping coffee, waiting for the footsteps. When they started, I no longer held my breath. No longer felt the icy fear creeping up my spine. I would simply listen, letting them pass. It was as if we had reached an understanding. The staircase was a bridge between past and present, carrying someone locked in time. A person who had walked those steps so many times in life that their presence had worn itself into the wood, leaving behind an echo that refused to fade. Maybe they had unfinished business. Maybe they didn't even know they were still here. Or maybe, like me, they just couldn't leave. The renovations finished. The office space was rented out. Life moved on, as it always does. But the footsteps never stopped. I still own the building. I still hear them. And now, when I sit alone in the quiet of the evening, listening to that familiar pattern on the stairs, I no longer feel fear. I feel something else. A quiet acknowledgement. A shared space between the living and the unknown. A presence that belongs to the building, just as I do. I never believed in ghosts. I still don't, not in the way most people do. But there are things that happen in this world that can't be explained. Things that slip through the cracks of reason, lurking in the edges of the ordinary. My name is Daniel Carter. I'm 34 years old, and for the past year, I've been raising my son, Lucas, alone. My wife, Emma, died in a car accident when Lucas was just 2. One moment, she was kissing us goodbye before heading to work, and the next, she was gone, taken by a patch of black ice on the freeway. Losing her felt like having the air crushed out of my lungs. The weight of grief settled in my chest and never fully left. But no matter how much I hurt, Lucas still needed a father. So I did my best. I worked long hours to keep our lives stable, trying to make up for the missing piece in our home. Shortly after Emma's passing, I bought a house. Nothing fancy, just a small, 2-bedroom home in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The kind of place I thought would be good for raising a child. It was old, built in the 1950s, with creaky wooden floors and a large attic that I never found a use for. The hallway leading to the bedrooms was dim, even during the day, the kind of place that made you instinctively check over your shoulder at night. But it was affordable, and it was a fresh start. Lucas adjusted better than I expected. He was a quiet kid, always had been, but he still smiled, still laughed, still asked about mommy sometimes. Those were the hardest moments. With my long work hours, I wanted a way to keep an eye on him at night, so I installed a baby monitor in his bedroom. One of those modern ones with night vision and two-way audio. If he woke up scared, I could reassure him from my phone, even if I was in the next room. It gave me peace of mind. At first, everything was fine. The house was quiet, too quiet at times, but I chalked it up to living alone with a toddler. The silence of a house with just 2 people can feel heavier than one with none at all. Then, one night, something strange happened. I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, when I decided to check the baby monitor. The grainy, green-tinted feed flickered to life on my screen. Lucas was curled up in bed, his small chest rising and falling steadily. But there was something else. A whisper. Soft, almost too faint to hear. A breath of sound beneath the steady hum of white noise. I frowned, raising the volume slightly. Lucas stirred but didn't wake. His lips were slightly parted, but he wasn't speaking. Sleep talking, I muttered to myself. Kids did that, right? I turned off the monitor and went asleep. The next night, the whispering returned. But this time, Lucas's lips weren't moving at all. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Just the house settling, my overworked mind playing tricks on me. But some things aren't so easy to explain away. It started with the humming. Most nights, I checked the baby monitor before going to sleep. Lucas was usually curled up in his blankets, breathing softly, the rhythmic sound filling the otherwise silent room. But one night, I heard something else, faint, almost imperceptible at first. A lullaby. Not clear words, just a soft, breathy melody, like someone humming an old tune. It was distant, but unmistakable. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The sound wasn't coming from Lucas. His tiny chest rose and fell steadily, undisturbed. My pulse quickened as I reached for my phone, flipping through the settings on the monitor. Maybe it had picked up interference from another house? But the moment I stood up and opened my bedroom door, the humming stopped. I walked to Lucas's room, pushing the door open carefully so I wouldn't wake him. The air inside was still, heavy with the warmth of sleep. The baby monitor sat on a shelf, its small lens glowing red in the dark. Nothing seemed out of place. I checked the closet, under the crib, nothing. Just my own stupid paranoia. Shaking my head, I returned to bed. But sleep didn't come easily that night. A few days later, something else happened. I was in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner when I heard Lucas giggling from his room. It wasn't unusual, he played by himself all the time. But then, I heard him speaking. At first, I thought he was just making up voices for his toys, like he sometimes did. But something about it made me pause. His laughter was light, happy, but responsive, like he was actually having a conversation. I walked down the hallway and peeked inside. Lucas was sitting on the floor, his stuffed bunny in his lap, staring at the far corner of the room. "What are you up to, buddy?" I asked. He turned to look at me, grinning. "I'm playing." "Playing with who?" Lucas pointed to the corner. "The lady." My stomach tightened. "What lady?" "The lady in the corner," he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. I glanced at the empty space he was pointing to. There was nothing there, just the shadowy corner where the dim light from the hallway didn't quite reach. I forced a smile. "Oh yeah? What's her name?" Lucas just shrugged. "She don't say." I tried to laugh it off. Kids had imaginary friends, right? It was normal. But that night, when I checked the baby monitor, I saw something that made my skin crawl. The camera had moved. It was supposed to be fixed, pointed directly at Lucas's crib, but now the lens was turned slightly, facing the corner. The same corner Lucas had pointed to. I frowned and adjusted it back. Maybe Lucas had gotten out of bed and bumped it? He was old enough to climb now, though he usually called for me when he wanted to get up. Still, I secured the monitor, making sure it was tightly positioned. Then I went to bed. The next morning, I checked it again. It was facing the corner. I should have taken Lucas and left, right then and there. But when you're living through something like this, you don't always see the danger for what it is. You make excuses, try to rationalize the impossible. I told myself it was just the camera's angle shifting on its own, that the whispering was interference, that kids have overactive imaginations. But then I saw the footage. It was late, sometime after midnight, and I was sitting in bed, exhausted but too wired to sleep. For the past few nights, I've been leaving the baby monitor app open on my phone, just in case. But tonight, I decided to check the recorded footage. Most of it was normal, just Lucas sleeping, rolling over occasionally. But then I reached the recording from the night before. At exactly 3:15 a.m., the screen flickered slightly, like the signal had momentarily glitched. And then, in the farthest corner of the room, something appeared. A shadow. It wasn't moving, wasn't shifting or swaying like a trick of the light. It was solid, human-shaped. It just stood there, facing Lucas's crib, watching. My heart pounded so hard I could barely hear anything else. I scrubbed through the footage, checking if I had walked in at some point, if maybe I'd forgotten. But I hadn't. I had never entered the room. The figure stayed in the corner for exactly 6 minutes before the screen glitched again, and then it was gone. I threw my blankets off and ran down the hall. Lucas was still asleep, curled up under his blankets. The room was empty, completely empty. But the baby monitor, the damn camera, was facing the corner again. I ripped it off the shelf and turned it toward the crib myself. My hands were shaking. I stood there for a long time, staring into the dark. My own breathing was too loud, too uneven. Finally, I forced myself to leave, though I barely slept that night. The next night, I woke up to a sound that made my skin crawl. Heavy, crackling static. I groggily reached for my phone, thinking maybe the monitor had disconnected or lost signal. But when I turned up the volume, the static changed, morphed. There was a voice in it. Not clear, not fully formed, but there. A low, whispering voice, hissing through the distortion. I froze, straining to hear. It was faint, but I could make out a few syllables. Luacas. I sat up straight, my blood turning to ice. The voice was saying my son's name. Then, through the grainy static, I heard something even worse. A tiny, sleepy response. I love you too, Mommy. My stomach dropped. I was out of bed and moving before I could think, nearly tripping over myself as I rushed down the hall. I burst into Lucas's room and flicked on the light. He stirred, rubbing his eyes. Daddy? He mumbled, squinting against the brightness. I scanned the room, my breath coming fast and hard. Nothing. No shadow. No presence, just my son, confused and drowsy. But then my eyes landed on the baby monitor. The camera was pointed at the corner again. I tried to tell myself it was a nightmare. That exhaustion was messing with me. But then Lucas changed. During the day, he spoke less. He used to talk to me all the time about his favorite cartoons, his stuffed bunny, what snacks he wanted. But now, he barely spoke at all. He spent more time staring at the baby monitor, his little eyes fixated on the glowing red lens, like he was waiting for something, or someone. One afternoon, while I was folding laundry in the living room, Lucas walked in and stood in the doorway. She said you make too much noise, he murmured. I turned to him slowly. What? The lady, he said, like I should already know. She said you're too loud. A cold shiver ran down my spine. That night, I lay in bed, heart pounding with every creak of the house. I kept my bedroom door open, listening for any sound, any whisper of movement. At some point, I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, my bedroom door slammed shut. Hard. So hard the walls rattled. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The whispers, the shifting camera, the presence. Something was in this house with us, and I needed to know what. The next morning, after dropping Lucas off at daycare, I sat in my car and pulled up my laptop. My hands trembled as I typed the house's address into a search engine. At first, nothing came up, just listings, tax records, boring paperwork. But then, buried in an old forum, I found something. A name, Eleanor Green. I clicked on the link, and an article from nearly 50 years ago loaded. The headline sent a chill through me. Local woman found dead in home. No family to claim the body. I swallowed hard and kept reading. Eleanor had lived in this house alone for decades. Neighbors described her as quiet, lonely. She had no children, no family to visit her. But there was something else, a rumor. She always wanted a child, one neighbor had said. Talked about it all the time. But she never had one. Never even married. I scrolled further. Eleanor's body was found in what was now Lucas's bedroom. She had died sitting in the corner, alone, her frail body giving out after years of solitude. No one noticed until the smell seeped into the walls. I felt sick. That corner, the one Lucas stared at, the one the baby monitor always faced. It wasn't just a shadow. It was her. That evening, I sat with Lucas on the couch, trying to keep my voice calm. Hey, buddy, I said, can I ask you something? He nodded, playing absent-mindedly with his stuffed bunny. The lady in the corner, I said carefully. What does she look like? Lucas didn't hesitate. She's old and sad. A shiver ran down my spine. Does she talk to you? Lucas looked up at me then, his small face blank, emotionless. She says you don't belong here. Only me. My throat went dry. Why would she say that? Lucas just shrugged and turned back to his bunny, as if none of this mattered, as if he was used to it. That night, I made a decision. I set the baby monitor to record. All night. I needed proof. I needed to see, to know that I wasn't losing my mind. I placed the camera directly in front of the crib, making sure it wouldn't move. Then, for the first time since moving in, I locked Lucas's door from the outside. I didn't know if it would help, but I had to try something. Then I waited. At 3:33 a.m., I woke to a strange, suffocating stillness. Like the house itself was holding its breath. Heart pounding, I grabbed my phone and played back the footage. At first, it was just Lucas, lying still. Then, at 3:15 a.m., he sat up. His posture was rigid. His face was eerily blank, not groggy, not confused, just empty. Then, at 3:33 a.m., the temperature on the monitor dropped drastically, causing the feed to flicker. And she appeared. The figure materialized beside him, pale and horribly thin. Her hollow eyes stared ahead, sunken deep into her skull. Her mouth moved slightly, but no words came out, just a faint, breathy hiss. And then, slowly, her head began to turn toward the camera. My entire body locked up, as if she knew I was watching, as if she was waiting for me. Her mouth parted. Her lips stretched into a grotesque, unnatural smile. Then, in a whispery, rasping voice, she spoke. "He is mine now." The screen glitched violently, static erupting across the feed. The image distorted, stretching and twisting, her face warping into something unnatural. Then, darkness. The monitor cut to black. I wasn't staying in that house another night. I spent the entire morning packing. Clothes, essentials, anything I could fit into 2 duffel bags. I didn't care where we went. I just knew we had to get out. Lucas sat on the bed, hugging his stuffed bunny. He wasn't talking much, just watching me with those wide, knowing eyes. "Hey, buddy," I said, kneeling down in front of him. "We're gonna go on a little trip, okay?" He blinked slowly. "Where?" "Away from here," I said. "Somewhere safe." Lucas hesitated, glancing toward the hallway. Then, in a voice so soft I almost missed it, he whispered, "She won't like that." A cold chill ran through me. "She doesn't get to decide," I said, zipping up the bags. Lucas didn't respond. He just stared at me, his little fingers tightening around his bunny's ears. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept my bags by the door, keys in my pocket, Lucas's shoes ready by the couch. As soon as the sun came up, I was out of there. Or so I thought, because at 3:33 a.m., I woke up to find Lucas's bed empty. Panic jolted me awake. "Lucas," I called, heart hammering. Silence. I grabbed my phone and flicked on the flashlight, rushing out of my bedroom. The house felt wrong, too cold, too still. Then I saw him. Lucas was standing in the hallway, facing the attic door, his tiny figure bathed in the dim glow of the nightlight. "Lucas," I breathed, stepping toward him. "What are you doing?" His little head tilted slightly. His voice was so quiet when he answered. "She says I can't go." My stomach twisted. "Come here, buddy." He didn't move. I moved toward him, reaching out, but then, bang, the attic door shuddered violently. I nearly fell backward as the entire house seemed to groan, the wooden floorboards creaking under some unseen weight. Lucas turned to me then, and for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. "Daddy," he whispered. "She's mad." I didn't think. I just grabbed him and ran. The house fought back. The hallway warped around us, stretching, twisting, doors slamming shut on their own. The baby monitor in Lucas's room blared to life, spewing out a horrible, high-pitched shriek that made my ears ring. Through the static, through the distortion, a voice rose, thin, fragile, but furious. "He is mine." I ran faster. I could hear footsteps behind me. Not mine, not Lucas's. Something else. Something cold breathing against the back of my neck. I reached the front door and yanked it open. And that's when Lucas screamed. Not a tantrum, a scream of pain. He clawed at his chest, his tiny fingers digging into his skin like something was pulling at him, tearing him away from me. The air around us thickened, like unseen hands were trying to rip him from my arms. I held him tighter. "Let him go," I shouted. A whisper curled around me like a breath of ice. If you take him, I will never stop looking for him. Lucas sobbed into my shoulder. His little body trembled against mine. I didn't hesitate. I ran out the door, into the freezing night air, straight to the car. As soon as we crossed the threshold, the weight vanished. The static, the whispers, the crushing force, gone. I threw open the car door, strapped Lucas in with shaking hands, and peeled out of the driveway. I didn't look back. I never looked back. I never told anyone the full story. Not my coworkers, not my sister when she asked why we suddenly moved 2 states away. Not even Lucas, though I knew he remembered. At first, he barely spoke. The first few weeks in our new apartment, he clung to me constantly, as if afraid I might disappear. But over time, the color came back to his cheeks. He started laughing again, talking about cartoons and his favorite snacks. He never mentioned Eleanor, and I never asked. I convinced myself it was over, that we had escaped, that ghosts, real or imagined, couldn't follow us across state lines. But I was wrong. It had been almost a year since we left. I had long since thrown out the baby monitor, or at least I thought I had, because one night, as I passed Lucas's bedroom, something caught my eye. A faint glow. I turned my head, and my heart stopped. The baby monitor, sitting neatly on the dresser, plugged in. I hadn't set it up. I knew that. I had never unpacked it. My stomach twisted. Slowly, I stepped toward it, my pulse pounding in my ears. Then, the screen flickered to life. I expected to see Lucas's room, but it wasn't. It was our old house. Lucas's old bedroom, untouched, as if we had never left. And in the middle of the screen, she was there, Eleanor, standing in the same corner, staring directly at the camera. At me. My breath hitched. The screen flickered, her head tilted slightly, her hollow eyes dark and endless. And then, the monitor shut off. The room plunged into silence, except for one last sound. A whisper, thin, distant, seeping through the static before fading into nothing. He was supposed to be mine.
And so, dear listeners, we reach the end, or perhaps just another beginning. If you enjoyed tonight's journey into the shadows, be sure to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments which story haunted you the most. But before you go, remember, the dark is never truly empty.